welcome back to Largo Reacts, and today we're going to check out the SCP Foundation Explained from the infographic show. I've seen some things from the infographic show. I like their art style, and I like their educational type vibe they got going on. So let's go ahead and check this out.
In an undisclosed location, a woman is being tortured. The methods of her abuse are too
Just right off the bat with torture, huh?
horrific to be described, and her torturers are death row prison inmates, the absolute worst of the worst. This woman's torture is constant, and procedures are put into place to make sure she never becomes accustomed to the pain. If ever her torturers express sympathy toward their victim, their superiors will have them removed and replaced. If they try to rescue her or put her out of her misery, they themselves will
The Torture Society?
be shot without hesitation. The woman being tortured is known only as SCP-231-7, and worst of all, she's pregnant. The cause of her eternal torture? The SCP Foundation. And you'll be shocked to learn that when all is said and done, these are the good guys. Because if they ever stop their brutal treatment of SCP-231-7, a treatment codenamed Procedure 110 Montauk, she'll give birth to a creature that will destroy the world as we know it. This is just one of the many examples.
I'm not sure how torturing someone keeps them from giving birth, but I don't know. Maybe childbirth works a different way than I think it does.
Of the objects and entities under the watchful eyes of the SCP Foundation, a mysterious group that strives to achieve greater good by any means necessary, and we do mean any. What you're about to hear is above classified, and be warned, what is heard can never be unheard, unless of course the Foundation gets its hands on you. So what is the SCP Foundation? In the most basic sense, the group's mission statement is right there in the SCP acronym. Secure, contain, protect. It's the task of
Secure, contain, protect.
the Foundation to, in their own words, contain anomalous objects, entities, and phenomena. Things that don't make sense, things that don't belong, things that simply don't fit in with our perception of reality, and some things that pose an existential threat to all human life. They refer to these contained anomalies as SCPs, each of which is accompanied by a number. This is a broad umbrella, as an SCP can range from benign or even actively helpful to downright apocalyptic if ever released. Much like the infamous Men in Black often reported by witnesses in connection with alien sightings, the Foundation works in secret to maintain a sense of normalcy at all costs, knowing the chaos it would cause if any of the anomalies they're harboring ever become public. Take for example SCP-500. To the untrained eye, the object is just an unassuming prescription pill bottle, the kind you'd see in medicine cabinets the world over. But the pills in this humble bottle are unlike any earthly medicine. They can cure quite literally anything, from cancer to a cold within 2 hours. But at the time of this writing,
It can cure anything. Any ailment, huh? Does that include like physical injuries, like a stab wound or a broken bone?
there are only 47 pills left. The power to cure all disease, a privilege denied to even the richest and most powerful in society. A veritable holy grail. Can you imagine the violence and horror that would break out in trying to obtain them if their existence ever became public? The SCP Foundation works in
I mean, there's not enough of them for people to think that, oh, I'll get a hold of one. But I would assume that a very few select very rich people would be throwing around a lot of money to get their hands on them.
in secret because the collective mind of society just couldn't handle the knowledge of what they're dealing with. They work with the approval of all world governments, effectively placing them above international law. Essentially, there is no human authority above the Foundation, because without the Foundation's work, there would be no human.
So that means they have a working relationship with every major government in the world? So they're secret to the public, but every government knows about them.
Left to govern. To understand the basic operations of this above top secret organization, we need to delve a little further into that secure, contain, protect slogan. Secure refers to the Foundation's practice of constant global surveillance and observation in order to detect and intercept anomalous activity before it can interact with civilians or rival groups. Contain involves preventing the effects or influence of the anomaly from spreading by either, in their own words, relocating, concealing, or dismantling such anomalies, or by suppressing or preventing public dissemination of knowledge thereof. The latter can involve practices such as using advanced chemical compounds or technologies to delete and then rewrite the memories of infected civilians, or even committing mass murder if necessary to cover their tracks. The SCP Foundation has in the past wiped out entire towns of innocent civilians to prevent danger.
Entire towns of civilians. What?
Dangerous information about the SCP spreading beyond their control. They can take lives at their own discretion and consider almost any crime to be permissible when the alternative is Armageddon. And finally, protect pertains to all operations meant to protect mankind from the SCPs, up to and including neutralizing and destroying them when possible.
What is that thing? Is that hair on top? Or is that skin? Because his ribs are exposed, so, like, is that, like, just his skin that is ripped off?
Some SCPs, such as the infamous SCP-682, a nigh indestructible genocidal reptilian, have proved to be almost impossible to destroy. Research is ongoing in many cases, as the Foundation explores any and all possible methods of reducing the threat of more dangerous SCPs. In order to help them categorize the thousands of strange and horrifying anomalies under their watch, the Foundation has created a system that organizes the SCPs based on the difficulty of containing them. The first of the primary object classes is Safe, pertaining to SCPs that require little, if any, resources to safely and properly contain.
Fairly obvious.
Examples include the previously mentioned SCP-500 pill bottle and SCP-999, a benevolent blob of gelatinous orange matter. SCP-999 has a playful, almost dog-like personality and causes feelings of happiness and euphoria in whoever or whatever it touches. It's even been used by the Foundation as a pacification tool to...
Just a blob. A blob dog, huh? Alright.
Reduce aggression in other SCPs. The second primary object class is Euclid, which refers to any anomaly that requires more resources to contain completely or where containment isn't always reliable. This is the broadest SCP class, and the majority of sentient, sapient, or autonomous anomalies fall into this category. A Euclid SCP might be something as huge, sprawling, and bizarre as SCP-3008. This SCP appears to be a kind of anomalous pocket dimension hidden inside an IKEA superstore, which is not only significant...
Pocket dimension in an IKEA. Larger on the inside. Could be infinite. So... sounds to me like Doctor Who parked his TARDIS somewhere in his... what is it called? The chameleon device on the TARDIS? He decided to disguise his TARDIS as an IKEA, apparently. All right.
Significantly larger on the inside by approximately 10 kilometers, but also contains bizarre, faceless entities which can become hostile under the right conditions. A Euclid SCP can also be something as seemingly innocuous as SCP-294, which appears to the untrained eye to be a standard coffee vending machine. However, unlike any other coffee machine, the input system on SCP-294 is a QWERTY keyboard. This SCP can manifest any liquid typed in on the keyboard, from standard drinks like coffee and beer to more esoteric compounds like sulfuric acid and disease-infected human blood. During extensive tests...
Human blood! So this can produce anything that's in a liquid state. So acid, chemical compounds, biological material like human blood. I mean, one would assume that you could punch in molten gold, right? Just get a cup of solid gold. What I would do. Get paid, son.
One subject requested the perfect drink and was given an odorless lavender-colored liquid. After consuming the liquid, the subject went into a state of euphoric shock. The subject later committed suicide, leaving a note which read, "I'm sorry, but at this point, everything's just one big letdown." Sadly, subjects dying during tests.
Oh, that's a little bit of a monkey's paw, isn't it? I want the best thing ever. Everything else sucks.
Is not
That's
uncommon.
rough.
The SCP Foundation essentially has limitless resources, including access to countless disposable.
It's like that episode of Rick and Morty where he experiences true level. Oh, the world is crooked.
Disposable workers and test subjects. The most common of these are so-called D-class personnel,
Oh,
which are
man.
death row inmates conscripted for the purposes of often lethal SCP experimentation or containment. The next primary object class is Keter, described by the Foundation as
sucks.
anomalies that are exceedingly difficult to contain consistently or reliably, with containment procedures often being extensive and complex. This can either be due to being an extremely volatile and dangerous anomaly or just one that seems to defy known laws of physics or reality. And
Or, I mean, you're trying to contain a black hole, which, to my knowledge, is kind of impossible, right?
it is thus extremely difficult to understand or contain. The SCP Foundation has a vast number of secret facilities across the globe, and while the Keter-class SCPs are not nearly as common as the Euclid class, they consume a great deal more resources to safely contain. One particularly terrifying Keter-class SCP is SCP-354, colloquially known by the Foundation employees as the Blood Pond. This SCP is a large pool of non-biological red liquid discovered in North Canada that appears to be a kind of interdimensional primordial soup. What makes this SCP particularly hard to
Whoa.
contain, as well as extremely frightening, is the fact that hostile entities periodically emerge from the pond and must be neutralized before they can escape the containment area.
So, there's a lake in Canada, apparently, that just spawns monsters? Kind of reminds me of that movie, Pacific Rim. Remember that movie where they had the trench in the bottom of the ocean that would just spawn the kaiju? It's a blood trench.
These entities have included a floating black sphere that can fire concentrated beams of deadly radiation, a 15-foot tall reptilian humanoid that seemed immune to gunfire, and a homicidal metallic humanoid nicknamed the Terminator
And a Terminator, a straight up Terminator.
by Foundation personnel. The most highly classified primary object class of all is Thalmiel, which consists of SCPs used to contain other SCPs. This can range from SCP-7000-J, a book of Latin incantations bound in dinosaur skin that can summon various other
Bound in dinosaur skin.
entities, all the way to SCP-4006, which is the entire state of Massachusetts.
Oh, the entire state of Massachusetts. Is that why there's so many witches? Just the entire state?
Thalmiel-class SCPs are the most bizarre and esoteric of the anomalies dealt with by the Foundation, but thankfully, they often pose less of an active threat than many of the Euclid or Keter-class SCPs. Finally, as mentioned earlier, sometimes the SCP Foundation deems an anomaly too dangerous to contain and just needs to destroy it entirely. A terrifying example of a neutralized SCP, and a perfect illustration for just how strange and abstract the anomalies dealt with by the Foundation can be, is SCP-4991. This SCP manifested as a series of bizarre posts across a number of websites about an apocalyptic event that seemed to be occurring on a different layer of reality, and seemed to indicate that a kind of deadly parasitic and carnivorous insect was spreading like wildfire across the globe, causing death and destruction in their wake. The SCP Foundation neutralized SCP-4991 by tracking down, containing, and erasing all infected posts across the internet before it could spread too far. Who knows what would have happened if the Foundation hadn't intervened? As is often the case with SCPs, it's probably best just not to think about it. The actual structure of the SCP Foundation is surprisingly transparent, with personnel classification levels ranging from Class A to Class E. Class A personnel are considered vital to the strategic operations of
I bet you're screwed if you're Class E, right?
the Foundation, and therefore are not allowed to be in direct
I mean, isn't Class D the ones that are already getting sent, like, to the chopping block? Like, what's worse than that?
contact in any way with any of the SCPs due to potential risks. Class B personnel are vital to local Foundation operations on SCP test sites and are only permitted to be in contact with SCPs deemed to be relatively safe. Class C personnel are field agents that have far more direct contact with the SCPs and often put themselves at great risk in doing so. Class D personnel, as previously mentioned, are essentially cannon fodder thrown into the jaws of death to discover more about the more dangerous anomalies on the SCP roster. And finally, Class E personnel are personnel that have been already exposed to the potentially dangerous effects of an unknown anomaly. Class E personnel are placed into quarantine.
Okay, so worse than being D class is E class only because you're still essentially a D class, but you've already been exposed to something. So okay, so I mean D and E are essentially the same, right?
Until they're deemed fit to return to work or terminated, depending on the results of their observations. In terms of actual roles in the SCP Foundation, the top of the pyramid are the O5 Council members, Class A personnel who have total clearance and oversee all Foundation operations. Below them are Site Directors, who manage the various physical Foundation facilities across the globe and report back to the O5 Council. On-site, researchers and containment specialists work together to better understand and combat the anomalies being housed at their particular facility. They're kept safe by the hard work of veteran security and tactical response officers ready to lay down their lives to prevent more dangerous SCPs from ever
please tell me there's a shark man.
Areas.
Please tell me there's a shark man.
If does breach containment and escape, or a new one is discovered, field operatives are dispatched by the Foundation to get the situation under control. These will consist of field agents who already operate across the globe and specialized mobile task force operatives. The SCP Foundation has eyes and ears everywhere. Their organization is influential and is embedded in every facet of society, ready to strike and suppress an emerging anomaly before any ripples of its existence can reach the wider world. Even here, we've only really scratched the surface of the SCP Foundation's extensive and frankly mind-boggling global and historical operations. There's plenty of information about the Foundation online, many of which people assume is pure fiction, but wouldn't that be the perfect cover for a real secret organization wanting to cover its tracks? As the quote says, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he doesn't exist. Ultimately, the SCP Foundation is on the side of mankind, but that doesn't mean it'll always act in our best interests. After all,
not if they're going to be wiping out whole villages of civilians to keep a secret.
If it means preserving the peace and getting another anomaly under wraps, the Foundation won't hesitate to terminate you and everyone you know without a second thought. Whether you'd want to face off against the Foundation itself or one of the anomalies they wish to contain is ultimately up to you, but trust us, neither would...
Is that a plague doctor?
...end well for you. Oh, speaking of which, there's another SCP we forgot to mention that's quite literally unspeakable. SCP-2521 is a creature that's made entirely of strange black tendrils that envelop and smother the creature's prey. No written records of the creature exist outside of pictograms because it immediately attacks and
And how would anybody know about it?
Consumes any information produced about it. This includes speech, as the creature will appear and consume anyone who... Oh god. Oh no. It's here. It's here. Help me! Ah! Pay no mind to what you just witnessed.
Okay, so this is pretty interesting. The SCP Foundation. I do like the infographic artwork that they do. I'm a fan of that. The concept of the SCP Foundation is pretty interesting. There used to be a couple of old shows on the Sci-Fi Channel that kind of remind me of this. There were two in particular. One was called Warehouse 13, and the other one was called Eureka. They were basically sister shows. I think they even had some crossover episodes. But the idea behind Warehouse 13 was very similar to the SCP Foundation. Their whole shtick was going out, finding objects that had strange properties, bringing them back to the warehouse and storing them there. And it was all kinds of just wild stuff. Just use your imagination. Magic stuff, magic artifacts. I think one episode had a box where if you opened it, lava would come out, and lava would continue to come out until you closed the box. And that was one of the things that they had stored in the warehouse. Then you had Eureka, which was, Warehouse 13 was very, I guess mystic mystical, you could say. A lot of the stuff could be considered magic, I guess. And Eureka was the flip side of that. Everything was science. It was about a town that was built in World War II, and the whole premise of the town was they would get the greatest minds, scientists, engineers, all that stuff, put them in the same place, and let them work together and really advance science. Uh, cool idea for a show, and it's kind of like the SCP Foundation has taken Warehouse 13 on one hand, Eureka on the other hand, and kind of mash them together. But with aspects of other things. So it's like Warehouse 13, Eureka, sprinkled with a little bit of Men in Black in there, and maybe something like Shield or Hydra from Marvel. Maybe more leaning more towards Hydra because the SCP Foundation seems really eager and okay with just killing people. You know, like the Men in Black, they mind wipe you. Eureka and Warehouse 13, I don't think they really went out of their way to kill people or like experiment on humans. But that sounds like something that Hydra would do. And Hydra also has that kind of global reach. So it's pretty neat. It's pretty neat. It's like Warehouse 13. It was thrown in a blender with Eureka and Hydra and the Men in Black. And it's kind of cool. I will probably be checking out more of these because I find them interesting. And if you guys find these videos interesting and want to see me do more, maybe more of the SCPs, because these seem really interesting, or more of anything else, just like, subscribe, and most importantly, comment down below. Let me know what you want to see next. Thanks for joining me and have a great day.